Where was everybody when I was lecturing on the Chinese Coast Guard development? This is a topic that needs no introduction. It's of paramount importance to our Navy and our Navy's future. And I'm very pleased to introduce my colleague here. Just 1 second on our institute and the series. The institute was founded in 2006 to bring a real focused research program to China's maritime development. The speaker series has been part of the institute since the beginning. We offer a lecture about once a month to faculty and students. Some of the noteworthy scholars that have come through here as part of this series in the last year, you may recall, those of you that were here, we had Joe Fusman from Boston University talking about China's internal politics and the possibilities for reform. We had John Garber, who's a very well-known China scholar here in the late fall. And during the colder months, we tend to have a lot of our own faculty speaking, and I want to thank all the faculty for participating widely in the lecture series over the last 6 months. 2 other things I'll mention about the Institute before we start, well, maybe 3 things. Well, one thing that you'll want to know about is our annual conference, which is 10-11 May, so mark it on your calendar. We'll be negotiating with the front office to make sure those who you know, people who want to possibly even get a class, we'll work on that, but it is going to be, I think, some of the best scholars in the country, a chance to bring together Navy strategists and China scholars to dialogue about the future direction of our strategy. The theme of that conference is China's strategy in the near seas, so it's a hot topic. I also want to say that we do publish a monograph series, and I'll just pass these around. These are the latest 2. There are several more. Swing by our institute in McCarty Little Hall and pick them up. We have piles of them, and we'd be pleased if you would take them. I'm also circulating some of a book series that the institute publishes, and Professor Erickson here is a huge contributor to that effort and has done fine things in that as many others. And last thing I'll say is, by all means, if you haven't already, come and stop by our library of Chinese materials. There's a lot in English there to see, but it really is a window into Chinese thinking on a variety of issues, and most centrally naval strategy. So let me pass these around. So now let me, I'm very pleased to introduce my colleague here. This year he's a fellow at the Harvard University Fairbanks Center for Chinese Studies. He's also currently a fellow in the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations, Public Intellectuals Program, a very prestigious program. Before coming to Naval War College, he had the interesting experiences of serving at the U.S. Embassy in Beijing, at our consulate in Hong Kong, and also in posts with the U.S. Senate. He's been here now several years and is doing really leading the way in China research. He himself has pioneered many of the methods that we now take as sort of the core of the Institute's effort to understand China. So his research on the Chinese ASBM program has, I think, it's fair to say, has really created an essential debate, I think, for the U.S. Navy, and a discussion that needs to be had. So welcome his lecture here today.
Well, thank you very much for that kind introduction, and thank you all for coming out today. I know I'm humbled by the fact that there are many in this audience who probably know far more about this subject than I could possibly know. So let me try to make a contribution by bringing to your attention some Chinese language sources, analyses, and patterns that you may not have had a chance to be acquainted with. As Lyle said, in a way this topic needs no introduction. Chinese development of anti-ship ballistic missiles is quite strategically significant. Since the 1920s, the U.S. Navy has arguably put the carrier at the core of its operations. We certainly rely heavily on them today, and it is an incredible asset for our nation. At the same time, China's anti-ship ballistic missile, if developed and deployed effectively, and I might also emphasize in the absence of adequate countermeasures, which I do not think will be the case, could potentially challenge this projection of power in historically unprecedented ways, becoming the first major system to truly have the capability to bypass the carrier's protective air wing and threaten the carrier itself. Now, of course, there's already been one weapon system in history that has had the potential to do this. It is the submarine. However, due to China's ongoing weakness in anti-submarine warfare, this does not pose the same sort of challenge. So this is really the first land-based long-range system that may be increasingly capable of targeting moving ships at sea, including carrier strike groups. So what are the Chinese saying about this? Well, what I have found in the course of my research since roughly summer 2008 is a surprising amount of Chinese research, analysis, and even perhaps to some extent strategic communications on the subject. So let's examine this and see what it might be adding up to here, and I hope to allow for significant time in the Q&A afterwards so we can really discuss these issues. All right, some latest data points, and part of the challenge in following this subject is there's also always something new popping up, but just a few I wanted to share with you that I thought might have particular relevance. An unofficial but state-linked Chinese newspaper, the Global Times, has recently cited someone who is apparently a Chinese weapons expert involved in ballistic missile development as stating that China's DF21 Delta ASBM has already been deployed in the military. I can't prove whether that's accurate or not, but I think it's interesting that a Chinese media source with connections to China's government would advance that claim. Furthermore, in op-eds in People's Daily Online, again, a forum that is connected to an official Chinese media source, there have been opinion pieces stating that U.S. aircraft carriers are already an easy target, and implying that China's anti-ship ballistic missiles could be effective in this regard. Again, this is one person's opinion. There is a disclaimer together with her bio, but these are statements, bold statements, that are being made in fora that I think China's government would not simply allow to run wild with ridiculous and potentially escalatory claims. This seems to be a new ballgame in terms of the discourse that is being allowed in these fora. And finally, of course, in the U.S. Navy, the commander of the Pacific Command, Admiral Roughhead, has stated in December that it is his assessment that China's anti-ship ballistic missile has reached the equivalent of initial operational capability, whatever that means in practice. So to me, the bottom line here is that this is now a very serious issue. It's not some smoke and mirrors bluff that we can hit the snooze button on and not take seriously here. We really need to be using all possible sources to be finding out where are China's capabilities likely headed, what are China's intentions, and what messages may China be trying to send to us. Presumably there could be some important messages there. Now, just another reminder about the centrality of aircraft carriers and carrier strike groups. We can readily remember the 95-96 Taiwan Strait crisis, which I will touch on in a minute. But obviously, this was the idea of using aircraft carriers to affect geostrategy was right on President Clinton's mind, as he suggests here. Now, let me make a slightly broader point before we dive more directly into ASBM specifics, and that is that, well, the ASBM system, I would argue, appears to be developing in a fairly rapid and robust manner. At the same time, it's not an all-or-nothing issue here. What I mean by that is this is but one of a broad, diverse, and increasingly developing array of Chinese systems that attempt to perform similar functions. This has been referred to as active defense, area denial. Essentially, what it means here, as this whole audience, I think, knows, is increasing Chinese ability to hold foreign, including U.S., military platforms and weapons systems at risk by targeting very specific vulnerabilities in them that tend to be caused by inherent limitations in the laws of physics. Ballistic and cruise missiles are some of the best examples of these Chinese approaches, but conventional submarines and sea mines might be mentioned in this regard as well. So this is part of a larger approach that Chinese strategists and planners seem to feel is very effective in terms of securing their understanding of their national interests and maritime claims from what they feel are challenges to them. And as we can see from this graphic from the 2010 Department of Defense report on China's military, the ranges of these capabilities extend out fairly far from China's territory and even from its immediate maritime periphery. At the same time, though, the most high-intensity capabilities are clearly concentrated on that specific area. So they seem to have specific purposes in mind to try to hold foreign platforms at risk in the event of a crisis in these areas that we all hope would never occur. At the same time, however, in attempting to provide that security for China, these range rings also overlap the undisputed territory of many other countries. So China sees this as inherently defensive, but other countries in the region and Asia-Pacific powers such as the U.S. may see it very, very differently. And this is just another example here, and we can see from this yellow line the projected range of China's anti-ship ballistic missile. So what does this add up to in terms of what China's trying to target? Well, again, very much focusing on the contested maritime periphery where China still has unresolved territorial and maritime claims. This is really at the core of China's present strategic interests. I would argue strongly that, well, China is now on its 8th counter-piracy deployment to the Gulf of Aden, has sent a frigate to escort evacuation operations from Libya recently. That is not the core of China's military focus. That is not the core of China's naval focus. The very rapid and significant development is occurring much closer to China in the area that I just showed you. And I say that the U.S. is inherently vulnerable not because the U.S. doesn't have many countermeasures that it can use in this regard, but this is a particularly potent way of targeting U.S. capabilities and allied capabilities and friendly capabilities. And I think China knows this. I think that's precisely why China is taking this approach. Now, this does constitute a larger strategic challenge for the U.S. I'm not saying that the U.S. and China don't have many shared interests. They do. There are many ways in which they can cooperate. The China Maritime Studies Institute just has a new book on that, which Professor Goldstein has passed around here. However, at the same time, the U.S. Needs to defend its national interests too. And those national interests over the last several decades have traditionally included making sure that the global maritime commons and the other commons, air and space, are free for commerce and for the passage when necessary of militarily relevant platforms, and any attempt to render a significant area or region in international waters or airspace a sort of no-go zone, or a zone that might be closed off in times of crisis, or not literally closed off, but made risky to enter. This really goes against what I think is at the core of the U.S. approach as expressed recently in the new U.S. maritime strategy. There are significant public goods that the U.S. works to provide here with its allies and partners around the world in various types of coalitions. Should this be interrupted, that would be a serious concern for the U.S. Now, I think many of you have seen this chart from the DoD report. This is originally, of course, from a 2005 Chinese technical article by researchers at the Second Artillery Engineering Academy. What's significant here is China, in developing an anti-ship ballistic missile, is taking the traditional approach of a fixed ballistic trajectory and adding a terminal homing capability to that both could enable possibly striking a moving sea surface target, but also to make it the maneuvering could make it harder to intercept and defeat the missile. Now, I'm just going to click through a few slides here from China Central Television that show in a cartoonish way how an anti-ship ballistic missile would work. Obviously very exaggerated, but it's very interesting that this just popped up in a late 2009 Chinese program on China Central Television 7, China's official military channel. Basically, the sailor who doesn't understand much about missiles is first frightened by the cruise missiles. His commanding officer understands that the Aegis system in this conception could shoot them down. The sailor adopts a blasé attitude toward the anti-ship ballistic missile with ruinous consequences. So when this kind of thing is showing up on China's official military channel without any sort of an explanation, we have to think, what is this saying? Is it a directed message to us? What is this? We really need to understand this better. Looking back in history a bit, it's also very clear that ballistic missile and even anti-ship ballistic missile development in China has a significant timeline. I won't go through this whole eye chart for you, but let me hit a few highlights. Of course, since the late 1950s, China has been prioritizing ballistic missile development, and by this time has a wide array of very capable individuals and institutes focusing on virtually any aspect of ballistic missile development I think that one could imagine. As early as 1972, one of the members of the so-called Gang of Four, a group of leadership that attempted to seize power at the end of Chairman Mao Zedong's life and subsequently fell from power. One of the members thought it would be very appealing to have a shore-based missile focus that, in his view, could reduce the need to spend money on a large navy. So, of course, this fellow fell from power, went to ignominious defeat, but the very fact that this idea, this conception was popping up as early as the early 1970s, I think is significant. The real genesis of this that I would call your attention to is the 95-96 Taiwan Strait crisis. This is when the U.S. President Clinton deployed 2 carrier battle groups towards the Taiwan Strait, and this created a situation where China really didn't have military capabilities to respond and had to back down. Although some Chinese sources claim that China's deterrent was already accomplished by military exercises, including significant missile firings near Taiwan during that point. So that may be a little bit debated, but what is clear is China didn't want that result, didn't want to be shut down in that sense. And I have heard rumors that China's top leadership at that point went to some top Chinese research institutes and said, look, and in fact said, look, you have the resources you need, solve this problem. Well, work on this problem they certainly have. A lot of attention over the years has been paid by Chinese analysts also to the U.S., the former U.S. Pershing II medium-range ballistic missile program, the first ballistic missile in the world with a terminal homing capability, and I will a terminal correction capability, and I will get more to that in a minute. But diving into one of the Chinese sources, one of many Chinese sources that have revealed significant research post-1996, an apparently authoritative government-linked Chinese source, the China Youth Daily, described in significant detail the dedicated research by one expert beginning in 1996, further developing in 1997, really pioneering anti-ship ballistic missile development. This individual apparently won significant awards for his achievements in this area, and I think what further corroborates this claim is the fact that starting around 96, 97, there's a significant uptick in Chinese technical articles published by this expert, by other experts, and none of these articles cite Chinese sources from before that period. So this really does seem to be when things got serious. There may have been programs already in development that were relevant to this, that were re-energized and channeled in this direction. So now that I mentioned a few Chinese sources, let me give you a bit more of an overview of how I see the Chinese open source literature in this area. It can be divided in many different ways. For purposes of simplification, I would call your attention to 3 main categories. I would say these are in a descending order of demonstrable authoritativeness. By that I mean the one I mentioned first, doctrinal, is the most clearly authoritative because it talks about it is linked to specific organizations such as the 2nd Artillery, China's strategic missile forces, which would controls China's anti-ship ballistic missile, among other conventional land-based missiles. It is vetted through recognized organizations. It clearly has a certain amount of credibility in that regard. Technical literature is also generally widely identified with specific researchers, such as at China's 2nd Artillery Engineering Academy. This research can be compared with their other research and institutional affiliations, and when they supply enough data in terms of numbers and specific concepts, often there are a lot of abstract mathematical equations there, but there are ways to double check this and verify it, although there are no clear markers that, oh, this has met a certain degree of central approval, this works for sure, it's not just a work in progress. So some of that could be just as authoritative as the doctrinal literature, but it's not readily possible to prove that. Finally, generalist literature. By generalist, I mean literature that discusses a broader range of issues. There are 2 major categories of this literature. The first category is what I would call more demonstrably authoritative. It seems to mainly be affiliated with China's Navy, other parts of the military, and China's defense industrial base that's connected with that military. Examples would include include the Chinese Navy publication Dangdai Haijun, or Modern Navy. It's their monthly. And then there are a variety of journals and magazines published by various entities in China's state shipbuilding sector. In both these sources, typically the articles are published under a pen name, what seems to be a pen name, or at least the affiliation is not given. So we can't be sure who it is, who wrote it. It's harder to be sure of some of these things, but in some ways these sources are the most interesting because they will discuss topics and examine critically issues that the former two types of more demonstrably authoritative literature generally do not address. Let's move to the doctrinal literature here. Since the late 1990s, there has been some movement in doctrinal literature to covering these issues, but the single most demonstrably authoritative source published and available to date is called Science of Second Artillery Campaigns. To the best of my understanding, this can be thought of as a handbook for the service. I think Chinese second artillery officers are widely educated with this handbook, and it's designed to inculcate them with how they should think about the use of ballistic missiles, both nuclear and conventional, the various types of campaigns and operations, and the various types of challenges that they might have to face and how to overcome some of them, although it is somewhat light on addressing potential contradictions, problems, that sort of thing. There's a two-page spread towards the end of this volume that speaks very specifically about using ballistic missiles to target aircraft carrier strike groups, and it highlights 5 different ways in which to do so. Harassment strikes speak to striking or targeting the carrier strike group directly. Frontal firepower deterrence talks about firing a missile missiles potentially into the ocean in front of an advancing carrier strike group to try to warn it away. There's no discussion of the potential escalation or dangers in doing so. There's no discussion of how the carrier strike group would know that this was actually an intentional non-hit and not a miss. And there's certainly no discussion of if you're basing everything, if you were to base things on a sort of seeker, how do you purposely make the missile miss? But it seems to be something that's discussed seriously as an approach. Flank firepower expulsion is a bit more complex. It's suggesting launch anti-ship ballistic missiles from one axis, meanwhile use other types of capabilities from another axis, and thereby try to force the carrier strike group away from an area that is seen as vulnerable. Concentrated fire assault is true to its name, suggests focusing on the carrier strike group, especially the carrier, and on the carrier, especially focusing on what are seen to be the most vulnerable positions. The island, the communications architecture on the island, potentially the aircraft on the deck, this sort of thing. This dovetails interestingly with a lot of Chinese research that I'll share with you in a minute on using submunitions to try to take out anything on the deck of the carrier, such as the aircraft, and render a sort of mission kill, rather than trying to sink the carrier. I don't see Chinese sources generally talking about trying to sink the carrier, and I think China's approach would seem to be to really just render a mission kill in the most basic and least casualty causing approach possible. Finally, information assault. This speaks to the idea of using electromagnetic pulse to try to render the Aegis system and other sensitive electromagnetic and electronic related systems inoperable. A lot of the Chinese sources are preoccupied with the idea that in order to strike the carrier, you first have to take out the protective Aegis system. So this seems to be one of the ways in which they would think about doing that. Moving on to give you some examples of more generalist sources. This is a two-part series that appeared in the PLA Navy publication, Modern Navy. This, of course, discusses more complex issues and contradictory issues. There's a debate in here about various technical feasibility issues, and this is more of that series. The different generalist sources disagree on a lot of things, and I'll get to those disagreements in a minute. But I think what's interesting is also the areas in which they tend to converge, or at least not disagree. They seem to concur that China's anti-ship ballistic missile is based on an existing medium-range ballistic missile, probably DF21, or also there's a discussion of a DF15 type variant and other types of variants in development. Again, Pershing II is really seen as a major inspiration for this. Some Chinese articles have claimed that it is strongly based on aspects of Pershing II, which is obviously a distantly related capability, so it's not a completely analogous capability. What I can say is I've looked at dozens of Chinese technical sources that emerged in the 1980s on the Pershing II, and they transitioned from very basic summaries to very specific analyses that seem to be designed to apply Pershing lessons and design specifically to aspects of China's programs itself. And there have been a few Hong Kong Chinese sources which can't be verified but sometimes are seen to have a connection to the mainland that say, look, you know, the Chinese ballistic missile systems took a lot of their inspiration from Pershing II. Russia's not generally seen as a model here. This is an unusual instance in which various American systems are often seen to be very effective, but because of historical reasons, China has more of the Russian heritage and more of the Russian technology access. And this is an unusual case where most of the Chinese sources say, look, that's not very useful. The Soviets couldn't do it. They didn't have the technology. They couldn't get the CEP, circular error probable, down low enough. So again, lots of analyses on Pershing, and I'm certainly not an engineer or a technical expert, but I couldn't help notice the Chinese sources pointed me to the idea that there is a strong resemblance, at least superficially, between the Pershing II, the first missile on the left, if you look at the reentry vehicle and the control fins, and then China's DF-15, I believe DF-15B missile. And this is some variant on the right of the DF21. I have not seen a picture of the DF21 outside its canister, so I haven't seen whether it has the same type of reentry vehicle and control fins. But my understanding is once you can develop one type of reentry vehicle, it's usually not that hard, and it certainly should be within China's technical capability to mate it with a DF21. So by this, I believe we can assume that for some time now, China's DF21 series, perhaps the Delta variant, has had a reentry vehicle with control fins that may have drawn some inspiration, albeit perhaps a somewhat distant inspiration from Pershing II. Now, moving to the debate in the generalist Chinese sources here. A number of the sources see major advantages. You know, the ASBM, poor country's atom bomb. This is a great asymmetric approach. Disproportional strategic effect. Helps to control, to deter certain actions within vis-a-vis Taiwan, within a Taiwan scenario. And perhaps in some ways the most enviable title of all, the fact that it's thought of as a trump card. A silver bullet, something that gives disproportionate effect. You could almost say a force multiplier of sorts. Now, I have to say this term, silver bullet, more literally, assassin's mace, shashou jian, or sashou jian. This, I think, has been misused in some American and Western analyses. It's a generic term. It can be used in colloquial Chinese to mean other things that are disproportionately effective. It doesn't automatically mean, oh, secret black program right here every time the term's used. But it's a useful concept, and Science of Second Artillery Campaigns, very authoritative source, also calls an anti-ship ballistic missile approach a shashoujian, or assassin's mace. So that is significant. What's interesting about the generalist literature, unlike the doctrinal literature which says ASBMs are a good approach and here's how to use them, and the numerous technical analyses that constantly say, well, there are some technical challenges or issues, but they can be solved through A, B, C, D, and we're solving all this, and it's all good, and the solution works, or the theory works, or the design concept works. These sources actually look at the issue more critically. And some of them say, look, this could be tremendously dangerous and escalatory to even brandish about, let alone to use. And gee, maybe there's a reason why in history there's not been a single precedent of one major nuclear power attacking another with ballistic missiles. So why should we be studying this? Well, it does seem that there's an ongoing debate, and I think one of the questions I'm sure I'm going to be asked is, why is there so much information out there on all this? Why have the Chinese published so much? And I'll address it briefly by saying, first of all, China's a lot more transparent in Chinese as opposed to English. So if you start looking at the Chinese sources, as I have, you get overwhelmed by how many indications there have been there over time. The second thing, and I'm getting a bit ahead of myself here, but a lot of people's opinions on ASBM depends on their institutional affiliation. And I think we can assume that China's made major technical progress, and ASBM has reached the equivalent of IOC, and is probably in the process of being placed in a position where it can be potentially used in some fashion, although China wants to focus on deterrence in this regard. But it does seem like there's an ongoing debate here, and it's a debate that we need to influence in terms of, strategic deterrence and escalation, and how does this work in practice? This story is not over by any means, not only in terms of the countermeasures that the U.S. and its allies can develop and deploy, but also the approach and how China would seek to use this deterrent capability to the extent that it has it, and also how the U.S. and China and other countries can have strategic communications about this. And to do a better job on that, we need to understand this generalist literature, especially the critical part of the generalist literature, because this may well reflect important opinions in part of what I call, and what Professor Goldstein calls, China's military intellectual complex, China's public intellectual complex. They have to allow a certain amount of free discussion and debate for the top leadership to have access to quality research, quality ideas, and for good scientific and technical research to be done. And I think with increasing openness of China's strategic research community and the proliferation of publications and debates, something could start off as a completely unofficial idea, but it could bubble up in policymakers' consciousness in China, and it could gradually have a significant effect. The reverse could also be true. Some non-demonstrably authoritative statement could be raised as a kind of trial balloon to see how people react. And if, for example, trial balloons are released that suggests that, oh, there's no problem with escalation and, everything's fine and nobody really will worry about this, it'll be fine if China does this. And if the U.S. and other countries don't respond, analysts and planners in China may conclude, well, probably there'll always be people who are worried about this, but it sounds like the chatter is low enough that, we can go ahead. Likewise, if they hear that this is an issue of grave concern and the potential for miscalculation is serious, and U.S. interlocutors are willing to discuss these issues very seriously, although not with any preconceived notions of where to go with that, that may be a different picture. So anyway, that's why I think we need to look at this very carefully. There is also a huge technical debate. This is ongoing. Parts of it gradually become overtaken by events as it becomes clear that China has certain capabilities here. So I'm not going to dwell on a lot of the specifics here. I can certainly address this more in the Q&A. What I would touch on briefly though here is the sheer amount of research that's being done on any number of very specific technical areas that could make this overall system, enable it to work and make it function more effectively. Synthetic aperture radar, using that to detect ships, and there are core institutes, for example, China's Second Artillery Engineering Academy affiliated institutes that work on that, but there are also many other branches of China's research establishment that work on related aspects of that. This is an example of the abstract of one of the more interesting and one of the earlier 2008 Chinese technical articles that talk in great detail. This is part of a three-part series, how to use submunitions to take out the aircraft on a carrier deck. What's particularly interesting here is it's co-authored with researchers from the Second Artillery Engineering College, but also a representative from China's Navy. So when we see that kind of cooperation starting to happen, this also can be a data point that suggests things are becoming more cooperative, they're getting more serious, there's more of an organizational fusion on this issue. Now, many people ask, why would there be these English language abstracts here? And I think the answer is, in the technical world in China, English is a language of prestige. English, if you want your research to be taken seriously, you need to have an English language abstract. That's how you get to be invited to conferences. I don't know how many international conferences these particular researchers go to, but we can see many other examples where that is indeed the case. I'm sorry this is a bit of an eye chart, but this is such an interesting technical update. I just had to call your attention to it for those who haven't seen. Vice Admiral Dorset has made statements on January 3rd and January 5th of this year, speaking to some of the Chinese technical capabilities, particularly the ISR capabilities that could support ASBM operations. And I think it's interesting. On one hand, he adds the caveat that, China's anti-ship ballistic missile is the equivalent of initial operational capability. There's still some complexity to that definition. He's stating that apparently an operational unit is not capable of effectively employing the system in question, whatever exactly that means in practice. But significantly, he also says China has both the space-based ISR necessary to support DF21D employment and China's non-space-based ISR to include aircraft, UAVs, fishing boats, OTH radar, could also provide the necessary information. So this is starting to add up to a very robust capability, apparently. Certainly, I'm sure this is a constant work in progress, but the fact that China has come so far by this point is, I think, rather significant. If anyone's interested, I have two articles available here. The first talks about China's approach to challenging aircraft carrier strike groups, and the second talks specifically to the space-based component of ISR development, including the very rapid recent launches of advanced Yaogan, synthetic aperture radar, and electro-optical satellites that could probably have helped produce the capability that Admiral Dorset is referring to here. In a slightly expanded Q&A 2 days later, he elaborated on some of these issues, especially the issue of how can it be IOC if it hasn't had fully, to his knowledge, an overwater test firing against maneuvering targets. And what he seems to be saying is China has engaged in laboratory simulation, test firing over land, and a whole variety of other approaches. So again, it's hard to make exact conclusions from this, but it does speak to a very robust and rapidly ongoing program. What China can't achieve as of today, we certainly have to imagine the possibility that they could achieve that tomorrow or in the near future. Summing up the Chinese literature, the Chinese literature on the subject, I think we can see sort of this rippling out of awareness and involvement. With something this big going on, gradually more and more Chinese experts are finding out about it. They have opinions about it. They want to say something about it. Now, we probably are faced with the challenge in open sources that the people who know the most can't say much or can't say anything about it. And some of the people who don't know anything about it aren't letting that stop them from saying a lot of things about it. We have this problem in American academia as well. It's not a situation peculiar to China. An interesting pattern we can see are real institutional biases in competition. Almost everyone's position on the ultimate feasibility and desirability of an ASBM is closely correlated with the interests of the organization with which they're involved. And that is a noteworthy point. But more broadly, what's interesting is we do see some patterns over time. We can see, however indirectly, the Chinese progress in this area. We can see them moving from discussing things conceptually to figuring out how they work technically and increasingly debating the larger strategic desirability. And I think this is really to get back to why China's having all these sources available that are saying this. I think this is part of not what we would call full Chinese transparency, but emerging Chinese translucence in selective areas. In order to deter, as China's military gets powerful, as China feels more confident, feels it has more to display and wouldn't be embarrassed to show these capabilities because they're starting to become significant, China will show more of that. We've seen that with the J-20 stealth fighter early tests at the very beginning of this year. 5 years ago, they wouldn't have had such a capability, but they probably also wouldn't have shown as much of their advanced capabilities either. Now, just a few thought-provoking issues. Again, institutional interests. There is still a pattern in the literature where the second artillery sources, without exception, that I've seen are all gung-ho. And a lot of the naval and state shipbuilding industry sources tend to be more pessimistic. There's even a great quote from one of the state shipbuilding industry publications. Look, if we had that kind of money to spare, wouldn't it be better to spend it on a more powerful Navy? But I think this is the sort of good old-fashioned inter-service rivalry in politics that, dare I say, we can see in other militaries, including perhaps even that of the U.S. I don't think this is serving as a fundamental barrier to the development and potential deployment of this system. Clearly, this is primarily the second artillery's show. There is an intriguing question of if in the future, moving forward, we will see submarine-launched anti-ship ballistic missiles, especially with the emergence of a new type of Chinese submarine pictured on the top right with a very large and thick sail that looks like it could hold a number of missiles. Will those be cruise missiles? Will those be ballistic missiles? Really hard to say at this point. Is it sort of a follow-on to the Gulf class? Will it be involved in testing? Hard to say at this point. No doubt there'll be an effort to do something in this direction in the long run. I just don't expect it to move as quickly as the land-based component because the second artillery has been doing that for so long. They're so comfortable with it. It's so much cheaper. It doesn't rely on the submarine being very quiet and hard to find. But watch this space. And I would argue I'm being slightly flippant, but only slightly flippant. If Chinese Navy and state shipbuilding industry sources start saying, gee, these anti-ship ballistic missiles are a great idea, maybe it's because of signs that submarine launching could play a role in the future. Some sources have said, well, is this really cost effective? I think the majority of the sources, and I would agree with them, say, look, China's determined to build this overall CA4 ISR architecture anyway, which is most of the expense of developing a robust anti-ship ballistic missile system. So the marginal cost of developing an ASBM dedicated approach on top of that, I think, is very affordable for China, especially with its official $91.5 billion defense budget by 2011. So I'll close on, start wrapping up on strategic communications. And this gets back to any discussion of Chinese language open sources. What are these sources saying? Why are they saying what they're saying? Is there some coordination in China, or is it an effort to sow disinformation and send a fake and unreliable message? I've really wrestled with this issue over the past several years, and I certainly think we can never rule out the possibility that there's some disinformation and certainly some shaping of communication, but I would challenge us all to think that the disinformation or the complicated communication could cut in different ways. Certainly this could be an attempt to try to inflate a deterrent potential that China didn't fully have. However, I would imagine that the U.S. and some of its allies have such sophisticated technical collection systems that could be a very costly bluff for China to engage in. To try to say something that was really fake when the emperor really had no clothes, so to speak, I think could cost China deterrence credibility over the long run. And I think what China wants here is deterrence credibility. They don't want to use these things in a war. They don't want a war. They want to gradually have more influence in the region and push away efforts by the U.S. and its allies to exert strategic leverage in areas they consider sensitive, particularly during crisis. Now, is there still debate in China? Is this sort of a placeholder? They're going ahead with the program, and some of the confusing chatter we're seeing comes from different parts of that discussion and debate. I'm not sure about that. I think we have perhaps seen that with China's aircraft carrier program over the years, as different factions and different parts and different advocates said different things at different times, and there were fits and starts, and it didn't always add up. However, I think China's starting to cross enough strategic Rubicons in terms of substantial statements regarding and perceptions of this system that I think they'd have to think very carefully about how serious this is looking. In other words, I think they're starting to generate concerns by other countries. I would presume that they would only be willing to continue to generate the concerns at that level if, as part of the equation, they were having real benefits in terms of the capabilities getting sufficiently more robust. In terms of a targeted effort to obscure capabilities, I think some of the Chinese open sources might actually be trying to downplay the efforts. Think of it this way: the effort is really to deter the militaries in other countries while reassuring the citizens in the other countries so they won't be worried or concerned about China, and so that taxpayers won't want to fund many more countermeasures and countervailing programs. So there might be a bit of an effort to do a lot of things so that foreign militaries could see the progress that China was making, but maybe having a few generalist publications that were really making it look like there were some real technical issues. That's just a theory. I'm just saying this is quite complicated here, and we need to look at it carefully. And it's clearly not just all smoke and mirrors. Look at what the U.S. Navy leadership is saying. That's not an issue anymore. So, what does this all add up to? What it adds up to is part of a larger array of what we could call anti-access area denial capabilities that are designed to work in combination, potentially, in multi-axis saturation attacks that Chinese analysts frequently advocate. The idea is perhaps no one system would render an aircraft carrier a mission kill, but if the carrier strike group were confronted by all of them in combination, it eventually might succumb in some fashion. And this is really a Chinese approach. One might call it a continental approach to naval warfare. 一路制海, sort of a land-based backstop that can help make up for whatever limitations China still has in the maritime dimension. Finally, I think there's a perception that even if China's deterrent is sort of unclear, the actual capability is unclear, it could still have an effect. It could still start to affect the thinking of planners and strategists and decision makers in the U.S. and other countries. And I don't think there's ever been an exact red line from our perspective a red line, but an exact benchmark in the minds of China's decision makers on this, where they either had no capability or total capability. I think they see it as a gradual increase in capability. And I think we should look at it that way too, and not just assume because they may still face certain technical difficulties, or because IOC means perhaps this but not that, that then the issue either totally matters or it doesn't matter. I think the reality is going to be more complex than that, and I think it's part of a larger reality where we see a number of Chinese weapon systems that look very effective on paper, that have very advanced technologies, but we're still not sure how they might actually be used in practice. Let me talk more about this in the Q&A, but bottom line, there's still some weaknesses, especially bureaucratically, joint operation, organizational coordination, joint operations, data fusion, that sort of thing. So I'm now happy to entertain any questions you might have, and thank you all very much for your attention here. Sir, thank you.
Dr. Erickson, in your research, have you found any talk or reference to an export variant of the DF21?
I have not seen. You mean DF21 Delta? DF21D. I have not seen anything conclusive on that. I've seen some interesting rumors, but nothing that I, at this point, could feel confident was something I'd want to put out there in the scholarly domain. I always keep a file of interesting rumors that may or may not ever materialize into something significant, and then I see if there are a bunch of data points in that direction, maybe it's worth diving in and seeing. But this is still in that file. It hasn't moved to the more serious file. Sir?
As far as the rumor you heard before, do you have any?
Sorry, which one? I've heard a lot of rumors.
I mean, that about their anti-ship ballistic missile, that their research, DF21 Delta, could that be a multi-warhead or a single warhead guided?
That's a very good question. These sources do not, in my view, give a conclusive answer to that. Certainly, China is advanced enough to have a variety of capabilities in that area, but to the extent to which they would actually be applied to DF21 Delta, I am not sure. I suspect they would want to make things work with one before they would move to a more sophisticated approach, and I would also imagine that miniaturization might be an issue. So I don't have a clear answer to that at this time, but it's certainly one of those issues to watch over time because they have such advanced capabilities, and they've demonstrated a variety of things that would suggest aspects of capability in that area. So good question. Ask me later on. Sir?
For assuming IOC, is there an estimate of numbers in the inventory and per unit production cost, and is there any open source CEP data?
Well, those are all great questions there. In terms of numbers, I think that's very hard to say. I mean, we can follow general numbers on DF21 as a whole, but I don't think that that's going to tell us, give us an insight into how many DF21 Deltas are being produced and developed. I mean, there are a few data points that we certainly need to watch. In late 2009, a website, a municipal website in Inner Mongolia, perhaps by accident or who knows, talked about that said that a DF21 Delta rocket motor facility had been completed. It's possible to use these data points to imagine a sort of timeline for development and production, and we could compare that to what we know about the patterns with other Chinese missiles. What I see a lot in Chinese discussions is the concept of a rolling deployment. There are other terms used for this, but the basic idea is test, deploy a few missiles and see how they work, and then produce a slightly advanced variant and see how that works, and can keep rotating in successively advanced variants until the overall force has reached equilibrium at a sort of general level that's seen as acceptable there. So there's no way to address the exact numbers. Sorry, the other parts of the question?
Production cost, if there is an estimate, and any guesses on CEP?
I've only seen one reference regarding the production cost, and it didn't make it clear how this was calculated or what it would be included in the cost. They cited $10 million per missile. I think this was one of the state shipbuilding industry sources, and I have no idea. I mean, it could have been a military enthusiast type doing a back-of-the-envelope calculation. It could have been more reliable data. But what I think the sources generally agree on is it's a lot cheaper for us to build these things than for the U.S. and other countries to develop countermeasures. So this is a great approach. We can afford to do it, and that's sort of the bottom line. In terms of CEP, in May of last year, there was a Chinese source on the internet that cited a top bureaucrat within the academy that was working on these missiles as stating that the CEP had been reduced to several tens of meters and that they could already hit slow-moving sea-based targets. And how exactly to describe CEP when it's really a terminal homing capability, I think I'm not well versed enough in the terminology to know how to distinguish this. I think overall the 2nd Artillery's missile CEP has gotten to be extremely good, and I imagine if the terminal homing actually works, it would, at least in theory, have the capability to certainly strike what it was supposed to strike. There are any number of things in the kill chain that could go wrong or could be intentionally disrupted, but in terms of the overall concept of the system, I think it's to the point where it's not just an inherent CEP issue where it's just going to always hit far off, or that old Soviet problem of being a 1 kilometer CEP making it useless unless it's nuclear. I think they're far beyond those types of problems. Please, sir.
Well, change the topic a little bit, but what makes you think that the Chinese submarine force is that bad that it poses no threat to an American aircraft carrier?
Well, no, I don't want to say that at all. I think if you look at the unclassified July 2009 Office of Naval Intelligence report on China's Navy, there were two very interesting graphics there, and I dearly wish they'd been combined into one graphic, but they were interesting enough already, showing the relative acoustic level of different Chinese nuclear and conventional submarines compared to Russian models. And what I took away from that was the nuclear submarines are still relatively noisy, but some of the conventional submarines are getting extremely quiet. And one can imagine, especially if they have AIP, which I think they would by this point, that would be extremely quiet. So certainly I think potentially the platforms from which this could be launched could be getting to the point where they are extremely quiet and would be a potent launch platform. However, I would argue that China's military up to now would have even more confidence in its land-based platforms, the land-based tells. And I think they spend so much time practicing how to hide those, they would be really confident that that could be hidden. Also, striking them would involve a strike on mainland China that I think none of us would want to see, would be terribly escalatory. It's different when potentially when things are out in the ocean. So I think already China's conventional submarine force is a significant challenge for carrier strike groups, but I think the focus up until now is on anti-ship cruise missiles, not necessarily ballistic missiles. Ballistic missiles could become more part of that equation. I just don't necessarily think it will be as much of a priority as the land-based part of this. So I would think to the extent that they pursue a sub-launch aspect, it will trail behind the amount of emphasis on the land-based aspect for some time to come. But you're right. It certainly is very possible, and maybe we'll see more and more indications. Maybe this new submarine will give us indications of that.
Well, it would be enough to have a torpedo.
That too. So again, my point is it's not all about the ASBM. We could have a whole lecture series about torpedoes and sea mines and anti-ship cruise missiles and any number of other things. This is just perhaps in some ways one of the more dramatic aspects of this overall array here. So bottom line, even if for some reason DF21D, there's a problem with it, it has a fatal flaw or a fatal vulnerability and never is effective at deterrence at all, China's still developing this overall capability that's having largely the same strategic effect and posing the same strategic challenges.
Have you seen anything in your research that indicates a combined arms type of use for the DF21, or is it simply an individual weapon? In other words, using the submarines to herd the carrier group into a particular location, maybe aircraft as well, so that they are more vulnerable to the ASBMs, or is it pretty much a one-of type of deployment?
No, it's definitely envisioned by many sources to be part of a multi-arms, multi-axis, anti-access approach. And of course the generalist literature goes into some detail on this and really makes strong advocacy for it. But I highlighted at least one bullet point in Science of Second Artillery campaigns that seems to be speaking precisely to a combined arms approach involving anti-ship ballistic missiles. So I think this is very much how it's envisioned. One could ask, to what extent is the PLA capable of that sort of approach at this time? My guess is whatever they lack to date in true joint operations capability, in specific instances, they could probably still cobble together using approaches that the U.S. military or allied militaries might not favor, but by temporal and geographic separation, they could still have a basic multi-axis combined arms approach that they themselves might be confident enough to consider using and trying to deter with. Yes, sir.
Keeping in mind the 2007 ASAT test and the reaction that it got.
And these things that always happen on January 11th. I have to figure out why January 11th. But anyway, sorry.
There's been discussions, and we touched on it a little bit, but as far as the emergency test, because on the one hand they do it, and all of a sudden they really get people to get out because they've demonstrated a capability. But at the same time, if you don't do it, do they really know if it works? And have you seen any kind of open source stuff on those discussions?
That's perhaps a more sensitive issue for China, and maybe it's not a coincidence that it's harder to find specific discussions on that, or at least I've found it harder to find specific discussions on that. My gut instinct looking at the overall picture is that they'll probably need that eventually to have a certain level of confidence, but they really want to make sure they get it right when they do it, because otherwise they'll be perceived as being escalatory or disturb people in the region and in the U.S., but they could also look weak if it didn't work properly. One in the rumor category that has no evidence that I know of in fact, it's very intriguing that photographs keep popping up on the internet of the Yuanwang 4 space event support ship, and rumors on the Chinese internet that it could be used as a target test platform. Whether or not those will always be rumors, we can't say right now. What I think is interesting, though, is a potential idea that they could have an at-sea test that was, you know, they made it a little easier on themselves to avoid risking failure the first time, but it could still have a psychological effect and could still show that they had some capability. Here's where I'd really emphasize again the sort of existential deterrent nature of this system. I think in China's conception, it starts having effect even before all the capabilities are fully proven. And I mean, it's one of our best students wrote a paper entitled "The Ghost of Billy Mitchell." And I think the ghost of Billy Mitchell is really hovering over this whole issue. I hope he'll give the U.S. military some good ideas and help us save us again. But the idea that even a test that's not completely realistic can still change how people think about the ways of war, make it appear that one nation has made real progress. I think that has to be examined in this sense. So yes, that is an intriguing question. I think they're just being very careful. What they don't want to do is mess up. But so what we may well see that test, either they do a modest version first, or they wait a bit and make sure they really are able to do it, and then they have something like that. I'm certainly something I keep my eyes open for.
Looking for a sequence of tests?
I'm sorry?
Would you be looking for a sequence of tests? Take the time. You can run the guidance system off another bus, off another platform. In other words, you probably will not see something. There will probably be a series of events that lead to an eventual test by some sort of a grand.
Well, based on what Admiral Dorset is saying, I wouldn't be surprised if some of these related tests and events haven't already started. I think it's part of a larger continuum, not an either-or thing. And the wording's clearly carefully worded to say, you know, they're not doing this. Well, it leaves open the possibility they could have done this but not this but not this. Combination, eventually it adds up. Anyway, the overall trajectory is rapid enough that I think it's one of those things, if we wait long enough, I think we'll see things that are even more dramatic than what we saw before. Yes, sir.
Largely in Western strategy, we look at deterrence as a negative effect. We're preventing the enemy from taking action. I'm no sinologist. I read recently that in Chinese, there's a different understanding of deterrence. It has both a positive and a negative implication, that deterrence is as much forcing your enemy to do something different as it is preventing them to take action. Is there anything in your research that indicates that perhaps that this is one of those types of deterrents, that they're trying to influence our behavior in a different way, force the U.S. To do something different, similar to what Reagan did with SDI?
Well, I think they're clearly trying to force us to do something different, namely change the current level of support that we are giving for Taiwan. I think that is, if this weapon system has a central purpose, that is probably the most focused aspect of it. The idea is by injecting at least a degree of uncertainty in how much the possibility that they could hold a variety of our platforms at risk. I think China is saying no repeat of 95, 96. That will never happen again. You will pay a big price if you try to do something like that again. And also trying to say to people on Taiwan, look, you know, you can't rely on the U.S. like that. And I think obviously there are a lot of sensitivities here, but that the way in which China's approaching it, kind of this offense-dominant missile approach, is very strategically destabilizing, which is why I think it's essential that the U.S. continue to make sure it has the adequate countermeasures so this can't change the rules of the game as we know them. Now, you're alluding also to research that argues that the Chinese conception of deterrence has more of an element of coercion than the Western aspect. I mean, to some extent, I think it's useful to try to see some of those differences. I think there are important nuances, but I think there's also a lot of this that is really two sides of the same coin. I mean, what the U.S. calls anti-access area denial, and what some argue is a misnomer because there's no denial, it's increasing risk, basically, China calls active defense. China sees this as defending its inherently just claims from foreign interference. A lot of people get wrapped up around the axle about this term's wrong, that term's wrong, this is misleading. If you just look at it from whose shoes you're in, it tends to add up. Now, where I think the nuance becomes important is talking about strategic interaction and strategic communication. There is a potential for miscommunication and for each side thinks they're saying something clearly, but the other side interprets it in a different way from how it was intended. I think the solution is to have more high-level strategic dialogue on this topic. It's not a panacea, but what we at least need to do is avoid the worst case scenario and avoid misunderstanding that could cause escalation that neither side actually intended in the first place. We need to talk more. And I think that's why Admiral Roughhead's periodic calls for more discussion in this area are very valuable. And I think Secretary Gates' efforts are very valuable. And I think it was very positive that Secretary Gates did visit Beijing in January and have some of those discussions. He outlined a series of proposed discussions and fora on these sorts of issues that could potentially cover exactly that. And I think the Chinese counterparts were very polite in saying they would consider them, and now I think the ball's in China's court with that, and we'll see if China's willing to discuss more, because I think as part of a larger picture, what China is going to realize is selective translucence is a step forward, and it's beneficial for China because it enhances Chinese deterrence, and it's also perhaps mutually beneficial, because as long as China is developing these systems, at least it will reduce the uncertainty about them. But none of this is a one-way street, and as China really is in the big leagues now with these high-end strategic capabilities, China also has to be in the big leagues of communicating about them, or there's going to be such a degree of friction in communications that it could cause a lot of problems, including for China, I think.
Let me, maybe I'll take liberty to pitch the last question.
Absolutely.
I mean, it's one thing to talk about strategic communication, but doesn't the conversation have to be wider than that? You know, I think the elephant in the room here maybe is force structure outlays for the U.S. Navy. So if you were to advise the CNO and the Secretary of the Navy on where to invest in light of this potential capability, what is your approach?
Well, thank you for that question. I actually really wanted to say something about this, so you gave me the perfect plug. The ASBM is just the latest development in a long series of developments that I was describing that are really adding up to a very significant challenge here. And especially in this time of very large but also constrained budgets, there's a risk that if we continue to follow the old approaches, China, with its amazing resources and capabilities, will put us in an increasingly difficult position. We want to avoid that without engaging in escalatory behavior that could really cause problems in the Asia-Pacific for both of our countries. I think the solution is, on one hand, yes, we need to continue to develop prompt global strike capabilities that can address any contingency that might happen, that we hope would never arise. On the other hand, though, I think the core focus has to be in reducing our vulnerability to these Chinese challenges and having targeted responses to them where they occur, as opposed to things that would threaten the Chinese mainland. So underwater, for example, is a great place to be, given the ongoing lack of Chinese anti-submarine warfare weakness. Space, while we certainly need space, is not a panacea because there is no defensive territory to dig in there, and the anti-satellite capability was described earlier. I think the bottom line is, moving forward, as we consider what our force structure and our weapon systems and our posture and portfolio going forward, we really need to ask, this is a simplistic question, but we still need to ask it, what side of physics does each of these systems put us on? Does it help us go to the right end of physics by allowing us to target vulnerabilities in say, Chinese systems? I think, for example, offensive sea mining is one of the most efficient pennies on the dollar solution, or part of an array of solutions in that regard. Or does it leave us on the wrong end of physics, where we have to spend more and more and more and more money without a guarantee of actually solving the problem or reducing our vulnerabilities, or very selectively being able to hold certain Chinese platforms at risk? So bottom line, we must make sure we get and stay on the right end of physics as much as possible. Thank you all very much. It's been a real pleasure.